The morning was silent, ruled only by the hum of my coffee machine and the soft glow of the window, until the door slid open. And there she stood, purple-skinned, long-eared, her golden blonde hair catching the light, an alien princess who had just noticed her portrait on my wall. "Why is my picture on your wall?" she asked, and I realized in that moment that my life would never be the same again. He woke to the soft hum of the apartment's artificial window, the kind that simulated a sunrise even though the city outside had long forgotten what natural light looked like. The hum was comforting, a constant reminder that, at least in this small corner of the universe, the world obeyed predictable rules. He rolled over, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and allowed himself a small sigh of relief that the morning was uneventful. That relief evaporated immediately when he heard it, a series of deliberate, soft taps on the metal floor outside his door. His pulse kicked up a notch, not in fear exactly, but in the awareness that his carefully constructed morning routine was about to be disrupted. He froze, staring at the door, trying to calculate the odds of an interstellar inspector dropping by unannounced. Low, but apparently not zero. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, more elegant than anything humanly possible, and there she was. Purple skin, blonde hair catching the simulated morning light in a way that made it glow, as if she had a sun trapped in her strands, and long ears that twitched with subtle curiosity. She was standing in the doorway, poised as if the corridor were a stage and she the only performer in the universe. "Why is my picture on your wall?" Her voice was melodic, with a cadence that somehow combined amusement and accusation in a way that felt impossibly deliberate. He stared at her, mouth open, trying to find words that would make him sound casual and not like a man caught mid-fanatic admiration. His throat felt dry. He waved vaguely at the portrait above his desk, where she stood immortalized in fine detail, her features more stylized than accurate, but accurate enough to make him blush just thinking about it. "It's, art. Appreciation art," he offered weakly. His hand hovered in the air as if that gesture alone could explain the absurdity. Her eyebrow arched, just slightly, but enough to convey both disbelief and a spark of humor. She stepped inside, her long ears brushing faintly against the doorframe, and he realized that every detail of her was intentional in a way humans had never mastered. The tilt of her head, the subtle shift of her eyes, the way her hair caught the light at just the right angle to make him question his own perception. "You're a forward species," she said lightly, though the corner of her mouth twitched with amusement. "Or perhaps indiscreet." He swallowed, trying to imagine a clever response. I admire talent." He gestured again at the portrait, hoping the movement distracted from the rising heat in his face. "It's inspiring, you know." "Inspiring," she repeated, the word curling on her tongue like a joke. "I see. And you thought displaying it here would, what, honor me, intimidate me?" "Neither," he admitted, feeling a mixture of honesty and panic. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice." He realized the statement sounded worse than intended. Worse, it sounded like a confession of obsession. He cringed internally. She didn't laugh, at least, not yet, but he caught the faintest tremor of a smile, a subtle acknowledgement that she was enjoying his floundering. She walked further into the apartment, her movements effortless, almost as if gravity itself bent around her. The furniture didn't seem to protest her steps. The air shimmered slightly as she passed, and he realized that every story he'd ever heard about alien royalty being terrifyingly composed had been incomplete. This one seemed terrifyingly delightful in a way that made him even more nervous. "I suppose," she said finally, pausing near the window, "that I should be flattered or scandalized. Humans are unpredictable creatures." Her ears flicked once, almost like punctuation, and she tilted her head. "Did you, perhaps, think I wouldn't discover your enthusiasm?" He laughed, a short, nervous sound, and tried to make a joke about humans always being accidentally obvious. She glanced at him, her eyes catching the light of the simulated sun, and he thought he saw a flicker of genuine amusement. "Accidentally obvious," she repeated. "I like that. Do you use this phrase often? Or is it reserved for encounters with alien royalty?" He grinned despite himself, the tension ebbing slightly. "Mostly with alien royalty," he admitted, though he wished he could claim more sophistication. Though now that I think about it, it could apply to most mornings. Her laugh, light and musical, filled the apartment. It was impossible to remain tense in the presence of such sound. It bounced off the walls, reflected in the metal fixtures, and wrapped around him until his nervousness dissolved into reluctant admiration. "Perhaps I should stay longer," she said, her voice teasing but sincere. "You seem to have mastered the human art of embarrassment." He gestured to the coffee on the table, a futile attempt at distraction. "Can I offer you something? Drink? Refreshment? Maybe not coffee. That seems aggressive in hindsight." She raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. "I have never consumed what you call coffee, and yet I am curious." She leaned slightly closer to inspect the cup, ears twitching in what he hoped was not mockery. "Does it really taste like burnt leaves?" "Depends on the brand," he replied, leaning against the counter. "Some are subtle floral undertones, others are just burnt leaves. Humans are inventive." He gestured to the small machines on his desk, some projecting holograms, some softly whirring and blinking in unpredictable sequences. "Mostly inedible inventions, really. We like to make things complicated." She bent over, examining a tiny hovering model of a spacecraft. With a small, elegant gesture, she adjusted the gravity around it, and it hovered more stably, spinning lazily in place. He gaped, arms flailing slightly as he tried to mimic her, but his hands only succeeded in sending the model careening toward the wall. She laughed, a trill of sound that made the model wobble midair and him scramble to prevent disaster. "You humans," she said, her tone amused. "Predictably chaotic." He joined her in laughter, feeling the tension of the first encounter finally melt. The absurdity of it all, the hovering spacecraft, the coffee conversation, the portrait that had started it, formed a kind of delicate bridge between them. He noticed the subtle movements of her ears, the faint shimmer along the contours of her violet skin, the way her hair caught the light in impossible patterns. Every detail seemed designed to captivate, yet she radiated warmth rather than menace. "You see," he said finally, trying to inject a touch of humor into the chaos, "I told you humans were complicated, and yet somehow not always dull." Her eyes softened for a moment, and she tilted her head. "I suppose," she said slowly, as if savoring the thought, "there is merit in your chaos, and perhaps I am curious to see more." The morning stretched on, filled with half-serious conversations, playful banter, and a few small experiments with his holograms and her subtle manipulation of the apartment's artificial gravity. He realized that embarrassment was no longer his dominant emotion. Curiosity had taken its place, and with it, a tentative trust. The portrait, once a source of anxiety, became a point of shared amusement, an inside joke waiting to be expanded in the days to come. At one point, a minor malfunction caused a small light fixture to flicker and drop. She reached out with a faint motion of her hand, catching it midair before it could hit the floor. He stared at her, mouth agape, and she laughed softly. "You humans would surely break everything if left alone," she said, the amusement in her voice blending with gentle teasing. "Fortunately, I am here to intervene." "I thank you," he said, realizing he didn't even need to sound formal. There was no tension now, just the beginnings of camaraderie, the sort that was both fragile and thrilling in its novelty. Hours passed with small interludes of humor, playful mishaps, and careful explorations of each other's worlds. She teased him about human inventions. He marveled at the subtle technology she manipulated with ease, and between the jokes and shared discoveries, he felt the strange exhilaration of connection, something that transcended species, planets, and the expectations of interstellar decorum. By the time the day reached a simulated mid-afternoon, he realized that the uninvited morning guest had transformed from an intimidating presence into a companion of curiosity, laughter, and quiet fascination. There was still mystery in her every gesture, every glance, but the tension had been replaced with intrigue. He didn't know what would come next, only that he was eager to find out, eager to explore the peculiar bridge of humor and fascination that now connected his world with hers, one awkwardly perfect, laughter-filled moment at a time. She glanced at the portrait again, and this time there was no accusation in her gaze. Only amusement, mild curiosity, and a faint acknowledgement of the bond forming between human and alien, laughter and awkwardness mingling as seamlessly as the light in her hair. "Perhaps," she said finally, tilting her head with her ears twitching faintly, "you are more interesting than I expected." He smiled, realizing that this was not a beginning he could have anticipated, but one he would not soon forget. And as she stood there, radiant and alien, a small, perfect thread of humor running between them, he understood that the first chapter of their story had already written itself in the gentle cadence of laughter, curiosity, and the unexpected thrill of interstellar discovery. The day unfolded with a strange rhythm, a cadence neither entirely human nor entirely alien, yet somehow perfectly balanced between their two worlds. He had grown accustomed to mornings of solitude, where the only interruptions were the occasional software glitch or the distant hum of city traffic filtered through the building's reinforced walls. But now the apartment buzzed with an entirely different kind of energy, one that carried the faint scent of interstellar lavender, subtle and alien, and the soft, melodic laughter of the princess as she examined everything in sight. She moved with the grace of someone who had never truly needed to hurry, yet every step she took seemed calculated, precise, as if the air itself bent around her long ears and blonde hair to make room for her presence. He watched, fascinated, as she leaned over the edge of his work table, fingers brushing lightly over a holographic star map that floated a few inches above the polished surface. The stars pulsed faintly in response to her touch, each point of light reacting as if aware of her curiosity. "Do humans always arrange their stars this way?" she asked, voice gentle, teasing, yet threaded with genuine interest. Her purple skin glimmered slightly under the soft light, a delicate sheen that made her look less like a visitor and more like a creature conjured from the dreams of cosmic architects. "Depends on the day," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Some days we aim for accuracy, some days we just make pretty patterns." He gestured at a collection of star clusters that hovered above the table in random, whimsical arrangements. "Mostly for entertainment, though. We call this creative astronomy." She laughed, a sound that rolled through the room like a series of gentle chimes. "Creative astronomy," she repeated, the words curling around her tongue in a way that made him almost forget to breathe. "It is chaotic, yet strangely pleasing. Perhaps humans are more imaginative than I credited." She tilted her head slightly, long ears flicking with subtle amusement, and he realized that even her smallest gestures carried layers of emotion and thought. The conversation turned inevitably toward the differences between their worlds, a dialogue that wandered through science and culture with a casual elegance he could hardly keep pace with. She demonstrated the properties of her home planet's gravity manipulation in small, playful ways, lifting pens, nudging floating coffee cups into perfect alignment, creating microorbits for tiny trinkets, while he attempted, often comically, to replicate her gestures with only human ingenuity at his disposal. Each failure elicited another soft laugh, another teasing comment, and he began to see the charm not only in her abilities, but in the way she observed his fumbling attempts without condescension. "I could adjust the gravity for you," she said at one point, hovering a small cube effortlessly between her fingers. "But it would deprive you of amusement." Her eyes glinted, and he felt a sudden, inexplicable warmth at being the source of her mirth. "Humans seem to enjoy struggle," she added, tilting her head. "I am still deciphering the logic behind it. You'd have to live a day in our shoes to understand," he said, gesturing vaguely at the small chaos surrounding the table. Scattered data pads, levitating pens, a tiny drone buzzing overhead, and a coffee cup that had somehow entered a low orbit around the lamp. "We find it entertaining, or at least tolerable, until gravity betrays us entirely." He flinched as a pen wobbled toward the floor, only for her to flick her fingers, sending it back into safe suspension. "Ah," he murmured, impressed despite himself. They shared a quiet joke about human clumsiness and interstellar etiquette, laughing at the absurdity of two beings from entirely different worlds negotiating the laws of physics in a small apartment. She mimicked his attempts to stabilize the floating objects, tilting her head dramatically, her long ears twitching in mock concentration, and he couldn't help but laugh at the incongruity of it all. The apartment, once a place of routine and solitude, had become a playground for curiosity and laughter, a laboratory for humor and discovery, where even minor miscalculations became shared amusement rather than embarrassment. At one point, he brought up the portrait that had started everything. "You know," he said, pointing at it with a sheepish grin, "I wasn't entirely confident you'd notice it so quickly, but I suppose curiosity has its perks." Her gaze lingered on the image, and she tilted her head slightly, ears twitching. "Indeed, and it reveals much about the observer," she said, her voice playful yet thoughtful. "You are unafraid of your own admiration, which is unusual. Humans tend to hide such things." She paused, studying him with a quiet intensity that made his stomach flutter. Or at least, they attempt to. He laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "I admire things openly," he admitted. "Sometimes too openly." His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment he felt the subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding. Humor, it seemed, was not just a bridge, it was the first thread of trust. The conversation wandered then, meandering like a lazy river, dipping into technical discussions of starship propulsion, the peculiarities of interstellar diplomacy, and the amusing quirks of alien culinary habits. She demonstrated a small trick, causing a piece of fruit to float in midair, rotating gently as if performing for his amusement. He attempted the same with a small snack, only to send it spinning wildly into the ceiling lights, eliciting another musical laugh from her. "Humans are entertaining," she said, shaking her head, "and entirely unpredictable." He grinned, realizing that unpredictability might be the only advantage he had in this exchange. "We like to keep life interesting," he said, "though sometimes it gets complicated." Her ears twitched, a subtle acknowledgement of amusement, and she leaned slightly closer, observing his gestures with what he realized was a mixture of curiosity and delight. "Complicated," she repeated. "Yes, that suits you, and yet despite the chaos you maintain charm, that is rare." Hours passed, with a fluidity that neither of them seemed to notice. They traded small jokes, playful experiments with gravity and holograms, and casual observations about the universe that spanned galaxies, planets, and the improbable intersection of their lives. The morning had transformed into afternoon, and he realized that he was no longer merely a host in his own home. He was an active participant in a delicate dance of humor, curiosity, and tentative connection. A minor mishap, his attempt to project a holographic model of a nebula, sent tiny projections bouncing off the walls, eliciting laughter from both of them. She caught one midair, holding it aloft with a delicate flick of her wrist, and he realized that every gesture she made was both playful and precise, a blend of authority and amusement that kept him simultaneously on edge and entirely relaxed. "You humans and your gadgets," she said finally, lowering the projection. "Predictably intricate, and yet charmingly flawed." He smiled, leaning back against the edge of his desk, watching her adjust another small floating object with effortless grace. "Flawed, yes, but that's part of the fun." She tilted her head, long ears flicking slightly. "Fun is essential," she said softly. "I am beginning to understand your species better than I anticipated." The afternoon stretched on, filled with shared amusement, playful instruction, and quiet moments of observation. He found himself fascinated not just by her abilities, but by the subtle humor she carried in her every gesture, the small smirk at his failed attempts, the teasing tilt of her head, the glint of amusement in her eyes. It was impossible to feel tension in her presence. Every awkward attempt, every misstep, became fodder for laughter and connection. By the time the simulated sun reached its peak, he realized that the day had accomplished more than he could have imagined. The alien princess, once a figure of imposing curiosity, had become a companion in a shared exploration of worlds, physics, and humor. The portrait, the hovering pens, the chaotic snack experiments, they were no longer sources of embarrassment but milestones in a delicate, unfolding camaraderie. "You are different from what I expected," she said at one point, voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Not entirely human, and yet entirely captivating in your chaos." He laughed, feeling the warmth of the moment settle deep within him. "I could say the same about you," he admitted. purple skin, gravity tricks, and the most dangerous ears in the galaxy. Her laugh rang out again, musical and genuine, and he realized that the sound was no longer intimidating. It was the soundtrack to the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated. Humor had dissolved any lingering awkwardness. Curiosity had bridged the gap between worlds, and for the first time, he felt that perhaps connection across species wasn't impossible. As the day drew toward the late afternoon, they stood side by side, gazing at the portrait that had started everything. She nudged it lightly with a finger, tilting her head, and for a moment the room was silent except for the soft hum of the artificial window and the faint buzz of floating gadgets. "You humans are fascinating," she said finally. "Chaotic, flawed, amusing, and surprisingly insightful." He smiled, watching her adjust a small holographic model with delicate precision. "And you," he said softly, "are fascinating too, in ways I'm only beginning to understand." The connection had grown, subtle and unspoken, threaded with humor, curiosity, and the shared amusement of two beings from entirely different worlds learning to navigate each other's presence. And as the simulated sunlight stretched across the apartment, highlighting the blonde strands of her hair and the delicate flick of her long ears, he realized that this was only. As the day drew toward the late afternoon, they stood side by side, gazing at the portrait that had started everything. She nudged it lightly with a finger, tilting her head, and for a moment the room was silent except for the soft hum of the artificial window and the faint buzz of floating gadgets. "You humans are fascinating," she said finally. "Chaotic, flawed, amusing, and surprisingly insightful." He smiled, watching her adjust a small holographic model with delicate precision. "And you," he said softly, "are fascinating too, in ways I'm only beginning to understand." The connection had grown, subtle and unspoken, threaded with humor, curiosity, and the shared amusement of two beings from entirely different worlds learning to navigate each other's presence. And as the simulated sunlight stretched across the apartment, highlighting the blonde strands of her hair and the delicate flick of her long ears, he realized that this was only the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. A day that had begun with a question and would continue into the unknown territory of laughter, trust, and discovery. The apartment was quieter now, not in the sense that it lacked sound. Floating gadgets hummed faintly, the holographic star map pulsed softly in midair, and the occasional mechanical whir reminded him of his human routines. But in the sense that the chaos of discovery had settled into something more deliberate, more comfortable. He moved with a kind of ease he hadn't possessed before, a calm born from hours of shared amusement, minor disasters, and laughter that had echoed through the room like a tether, binding two very different beings in a fragile orbit. The princess stood across from him, blonde hair catching the shifting glow of the simulated afternoon sun, long ears twitching as she observed him with a careful, teasing gaze. Her purple skin shimmered faintly, the light reflecting off it in subtle waves that reminded him of distant nebulae, vibrant yet serene. "You've adjusted remarkably well to human chaos," she said, her tone teasing but sincere. She leaned slightly against the edge of the desk, fingers curling around a floating cube that spun lazily in defiance of gravity. "I expected unpredictability to unsettle you. Yet here you are, managing this." She gestured at the gentle mayhem surrounding them, as if it were always meant to be. He chuckled, gesturing to the hovering coffee cup, the errant holographic projections, the small drone that had somehow looped in a lazy figure eight above their heads. "I've learned a lot," he admitted. "Mostly that it's easier to laugh along than fight it, and, well, that there's a lot I didn't understand about, well, everything." Her ears twitched at the hesitation in his voice, and he realized she was reading him with the same care she had displayed from the moment she noticed the portrait. "Everything?" she prompted, voice soft, curious. "Do you mean the universe, human habits, or me?" He swallowed, trying to make light of the enormity of the moment. "Mostly all of it. And yes, you too," he said with a sheepish grin. "I didn't expect to understand or even like an alien princess as much as I do." He laughed nervously, hoping the humor would cushion the confession. She tilted her head, a small, teasing smile forming on her lips. As one might expect, humans are dramatic, she said, though her eyes glimmered with amusement rather than scorn. And yet, I am glad you speak honestly. The capacity for humor, even in tense situations, is endearing. She flicked a small gesture at the floating cube, sending it spinning lightly toward him. And useful. He caught it deftly, grinning at her wit. The morning had been tense, awkward, and full of unspoken questions. But now, in the late afternoon, the tension had dissolved entirely into shared understanding. The room, once alien to her and familiar only to him, had become a small nexus where laughter, discovery, and tentative trust coexisted. "Do you realize," he said, leaning against his desk, "that this entire encounter could have gone terribly wrong? I could have looked foolish, you could have judged me, and yet here we are floating cubes, weird coffee and all." Her laugh filled the room, musical and bright, and for the first time, he saw her relax completely, the subtle tension of royalty and formality melting into genuine amusement. "I suppose unpredictability has its advantages," she said, tilting her head so her ears caught the light. "And perhaps I enjoy it more than I should." They spent the next hours in a curious blend of play and exploration. He showed her human inventions, some elegant, some absurd, and she manipulated them with ease, demonstrating slight alterations to gravity, energy flow, and light, all without breaking a single thing, except for a single pen, which she laughed at with a sound that made him nearly drop his own cup of coffee. They shared jokes about alien etiquette, human clumsiness, and the strange inevitability of two beings from entirely different worlds learning to exist in the same space. Each laugh, each small discovery, reinforced the bridge of understanding they had been building. At one point, he gestured toward the portrait that had started it all. "You know, I was terrified when I thought you'd notice it," he admitted. "I thought it would be awkward or worse. But now—" His eyes met hers, and he saw a flicker of amusement, a hint of the curiosity that had dominated her first visit. "Now it feels like it was the right way to begin." She tilted her head, examining the portrait with a faint smile. "It reveals the observer," she said softly. "I see the admiration, the humor, the honesty, and perhaps even a glimpse of the human capacity for wonder." She paused, allowing the statement to linger in the room like a gentle vibration. "I am pleased you were not afraid to display it." They continued their explorations of his apartment and her abilities, moving seamlessly between science and play. He showed her holographic simulations of nebulae, galaxies colliding in slow motion, starships navigating asteroid belts, all accompanied by his commentary, punctuated with jokes about improbable human piloting skills. She responded by subtly manipulating the simulations, adjusting light patterns, and sometimes causing small, controlled explosions of color that sent them both laughing. The room was alive with soft hums, shimmering lights, and laughter, the perfect intersection of their two worlds. Eventually, the afternoon gave way to evening, the simulated sun casting long, soft shadows across the room. He realized that he had changed. His nervousness, the initial fluster of embarrassment at her noticing the portrait, had evolved into confidence, not arrogance, but a quiet certainty that humor, curiosity, and honesty could bridge even the most improbable divides. He was no longer merely a human man hosting an alien princess. He was a participant in a dialogue across worlds, a partner in discovery and laughter. "You know," she said, leaning lightly against the floating cube she had been adjusting for hours, "I did not expect to enjoy my visit so thoroughly. Your species surprises me, not in a chaotic sense, but in ways that make me consider possibilities." He smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that was more than pride. "I think that's what happens when we let curiosity lead instead of fear," he said, "and when we add a little humor to every serious thing." She tilted her head, long ears twitching. "Humor, yes, I had underestimated its power. It is essential. I shall remember this." Her gaze softened, and for the first time he sensed something deeper, a genuine connection beyond amusement, curiosity, or admiration. It was trust, fragile but present, stretching between them like a thin, shimmering bridge over the gap of stars and species. He nodded, understanding the unspoken promise in her eyes. "And I shall remember it too," he said. The way even a small joke or a floating coffee cup can make a universe feel manageable. They paused then, standing side by side, observing the small chaos that had become their shared domain. Hovering pens, miniature starships, a coffee cup orbiting slowly, and the portrait that had started it all. The room, once an ordinary apartment, had transformed into a nexus of laughter, trust, and discovery. Everything that had felt awkward, tense, or uncertain had resolved into a pattern of mutual understanding, playful exploration, and connection. The princess reached out, just slightly, adjusting a floating holographic display of the city skyline outside. He watched her fingers manipulate the light with effortless grace, aware of the small details he had come to admire. The gentle flick of her long ears, the radiant sheen of her purple skin, the subtle brilliance of her blonde hair. She glanced at him, a soft, approving smile crossing her lips, and he felt a strange, warm sense of closure. Not an ending, but a full stop on this chapter of their shared journey. Perhaps, she said finally, tilting her head, the universe is not as vast as it seems when one finds amusement and trust in unexpected places. He laughed softly, feeling the truth of her words. I think it's smaller than we imagined, or at least more navigable. As the artificial sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, gentle shadows across the room, they stood in companionable silence, watching the floating objects drift lazily. The morning's tension, the initial embarrassment, the uncertainty of interstellar etiquette, all of it had dissolved into a shared understanding. He was changed, yes, more confident, more open, more willing to let curiosity and humor guide him. She was changed too, subtly, having experienced human unpredictability and the small joys of casual connection. Together, they had built something fragile but real. A bridge between worlds, solidified with laughter, trust, and the promise of further discovery. The final moments of the day passed in a quiet rhythm, the hum of the apartment, the soft glow of holographic stars, and the occasional drift of a floating cube forming the soundtrack of a universe narrowed. For now, to a single room, a single connection. He realized that the first chapter of their interaction had ended not with a climactic gesture or grand revelation, but with the quiet affirmation that humor, curiosity, and honesty were the true engines of discovery, perhaps even more powerful than gravity or advanced technology. The portrait still hung on the wall, but it was no longer a source of anxiety or embarrassment. Instead, it was a reminder, a testament to the start of a bond, a symbol of connection across species and worlds, a small, constant acknowledgement that trust could be built, laughter could bridge distances, and a human and an alien princess could navigate the improbable with grace, humor, and shared wonder. She finally turned toward him, eyes glinting with amusement and warmth.